it rolling, Bob? Is it rolling, Bob?
Well, hello world, this is Chris Gregory and this is Bob Dylan, A Head Full of Ideas, Season 2.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Welcome back to this second set of podcasts about various topics related to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is very much with us. He's been out on tour again. He's about to start another tour in a couple of days from when I'm speaking just now. So I've been putting together a number of essays, blogs or whatever you want to call them, which appear on my website, which is chrisgregory.org, otherwise known as From the Pen of Chris Gregory, in which I've been covering these various topics. And I'm also the author of Determined to Stand, the Reinvention of Bob Dylan, which is a study of Dylan's later work, which you can get hold of copies of on my website or at amazon.co.uk. I'm actually working on a trilogy of Bob Dylan books, which are coming out in reverse order, which I think is quite appropriate for an artist who is generally so perverse in the way that he does things. And in this first episode of the new season, I'm going to be taking you back to 1963, near the beginning of Dylan's career. And this piece is called Goliath II, 2 Dylan concerts from 1963. 1963 was the year Bob Dylan made it. At the beginning of the year, he was still a little-known folk singer with one album to his name, a rather startling collection of blues and folk covers with a couple of derivative originals, which had sold very poorly. By the end of the year, he'd become virtually a household name, partly as a result of the success of his second album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, and the adoption of a number of his songs by marchers in the civil rights movement. The most well-known, Blowin' in the Wind, became a global hit in a rather sweetened version by Peter, Paul and Mary. For most of the year, Dylan was still playing in Greenwich Village folk clubs such as Gerdy's Folk City and the Gaslight Cafe, as well as taking part in shows featuring a number of folk singers, often at East Coast universities, which became popularly known as hootenannies. He was still only playing a handful of full concerts. 2 of these, however, have survived in high-quality recordings. Most of the material has been released on the very limited edition 50th anniversary copyright extension compilations. It is perhaps surprising, given their considerable historical significance, that the shows have not yet featured as part of the bootleg series. These solo acoustic performances demonstrate quite clearly that in his live shows, Dylan was capable of producing performances that equalled or outshone his recordings. They also feature his talents as a raconteur, who often introduces his songs with humorous or portentous asides, so developing a kind of intimate rapport with an audience who share both his political viewpoints and his anti-establishment sense of humour. He is part poet, part stand-up comedian and part political commentator. When he went electric some 2 years later, the dismay felt by some of his audience was as much to do with the loss of this direct contact with his fans as the loud noise he was making with his band. 1963 was the year of the folk boom in the USA, when a mainstream singer like Trini Lopez could have a sizable hit with If I Had a Hammer, a catchy, rousing and rather generalised global plea for freedom and justice, originally performed by Pete Seeger's group The Weavers. The big record companies had begun to realise the commercial potential of such material. There is little doubt that the political context of the times influenced this new vogue. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had thrown the shadow of the Cold War into sharp and terrifying relief, which the rabid and fanatical anti-communism of much of the American establishment further underlined. Meanwhile, the struggle against the institutional racism of American society was resulting in a number of large protests, which sometimes led to violent reactions from the authorities. The key to Dylan's early success lay in the way he eloquently voiced the concerns of American youth about such issues. Yet, unlike the commercial folk of singers like Lopez, the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul and Mary, who encouraged audiences to sing along with their pleasantly presented anthems, Dylan achieved his fame with a harsh and uncompromising vocal style which was an amalgam of influences from outside the popular music mainstream, including many blues and hillbilly singers. He was also influenced by the dryly monotonal vocal style and the political subject matter of the songs of his hero Woody Guthrie. It was clear that by April the 12th, when he performed his first major concert at New York Town Hall, that Dylan had begun to accumulate a considerable reputation among the cognoscenti who were already aware of him as a songwriter and who shared his radical beliefs. The Town Hall had a history of staging challenging performances. In 1921, Margaret Sanger, an early advocate of birth control, was actually arrested on its stage when delivering a lecture. The hall had also developed a reputation as an arts venue, staging a number of high-profile poetry readings, from Edna St. Vincent Millay in the late 1920s through to the Beat Poets in the 1950s. It was also a venue which showcased the work of bebop jazz artists like Dizzy Gillespie and Lester Young, who the Beats especially admired. Even so, it is still remarkable that the comparatively unknown Dylan still managed to attract an audience of around 900. In many ways, the concert is experienced by its audience as a poetry reading as much as a musical performance. The concert programme even features a new autobiographical Dylan poem, My Life in a Stolen Moment, and the show ended with Dylan reciting his poem Last Thoughts on Woody Guthrie. The concert marks a significant milestone in Dylan's career. He shows himself to be fully capable of taking his act out of the folk clubs and into a much larger public arena. He demonstrates that, as a songwriter, he can switch between a number of modes with ease. In order to convey the meanings and emotions of the songs, armed only with his voice, his acoustic guitar and his harmonica, he proves himself to be a very accomplished actor, slipping as he does between these different personas while never losing the attention of the enraptured audience, who are, for the most part, hearing these monumental songs for the first time. In particular, the protest songs certainly do articulate the feelings of his young audience with great eloquence. Despite all of his later denials, this is the Dylan who would soon be acclaimed as the voice of his generation. Most of the songs he performs at the show are completely new to the audience, so the acoustic setting is a perfect way of transmitting his poetic lyrics, every one of which could be discerned quite clearly by the audience. Very few members of his audience would have experienced such a performance before. However, with his schooling in the blues and other forms of non-mainstream folk music, Dylan no doubt saw himself more as the inheritor of a tradition of poetic song. Yet it was clear that from here onwards he was applying a new and more explicitly literary approach to his material. The songs already display the influence of the Romantic and Beat poets, among other literary sources. At the time, Dylan had only recently discovered his voice as a songwriter, but new songs were now pouring out of him at quite a considerable rate. Some of the songs were already familiar to audiences through live versions sung by other singers. Only 4 of the selections were to appear on the yet unreleased Freewheelin' album. When Dylan arrived in New York, he set about a process of inventing himself as a public figure. Heavily influenced by his hero Woody Guthrie's partly fictionalised autobiography Bound for Glory, he indulged in deliberate self-mythologising, depicting himself as a Guthrie-esque travelling hobo. He gave a number of interviews in which he claimed to have left home at an early age, rambled around the country, worked in circuses, ridden boxcars, and learned songs from chance meetings with blues singers such as Big Joe Williams. All this always seemed a little unbelievable, as Dylan was barely 20 years old at the time and actually looked considerably younger. My Life in a Stolen Moment begins with some evocative descriptions of his childhood in Hibbing. Hibbing's got the biggest open-air pit in the mine in the world. Hibbing's got schools, churches, grocery stores and a jail. It's got high school football games and a movie house. Hibbing's got souped-up cars running full blast on a Friday night. Hibbing's got corner bars with polka bands. You can stand at one end of Hibbing's main drag and see clear past the city limits on the other end. After this, Dylan becomes more inventive, stating that he had run away from home on numerous occasions. He claims he was thrown out of an English literature class at college for writing a poem about his teacher containing 4-letter words. Later, we find him in California, New Mexico, Texas, New Orleans and other exotic locations which, like Kerouac in On the Road, he claims to have hitchhiked to. The narrative becomes even more fantastical when he tells us he has been jailed for suspicion of armed robbery and held up for 4 hours on a murder charge. The poem is somewhat prosaic at times, but ends quite effectively with Dylan in the kind of language that Guthrie might have used, outlining where his influences come from. What about the records you hear but one time? What about the coyote's call and the bulldog's bark? What about the tomcat's mew and milk cow's moo and the train whistle's moan? Open up your ears and eyes and you're influenced, and there's nothing you can do about it. Dylan underlines his creation of this persona by beginning the show with a song he had only played once before at Gerdy's Folk City in the previous year, in which he never performed again. A short but sprightly ditty entitled Ramblin' Down Through the World, which consists of one verse in which the singer declares himself to be one of them ramblin' boys, followed by a very lively and inventive harmonica solo. Here is Dylan in his Huck Finn cap, jeans and work shirt, still identifying himself as the son of Woody Guthrie, posing as a kind of beatnik hobo who has just blown into town. He then switches tack with a thoughtful and moving version of Bob Dylan's Dream, which combines the use of the beautiful traditional tune Lord Franklin, about another lost rambler, and presents a rich evocation of memory and nostalgia. The narrator and his friends are on a train going west rather than riding a boxcar. Although the song evokes a life of experience which Dylan had never really led, the emotional content is completely convincing. The third song is Talking New York, a lightly ironic talking blues which recounts Dylan's arrival in Greenwich Village. Dylan changes some of the lyrics from the recorded version, demonstrating that he is already unafraid to adapt his songs on stage. This was another feature of his performances he'd taken from Guthrie. After establishing this ramblin' boy persona, he later includes Dusty Old Fairgrounds, presented here in its only live performance. The song is fairly lengthy. Each of its 14 verses ends with the refrain, "Following them dusty old fairgrounds a-callin'." It maintains a lively pace and a breezily optimistic tone throughout. Here he extends the fictions of Stolen Moment, producing a travelogue full of colourful descriptions and inventive rhyming, whose narrator thoroughly inhabits the role of a travelling circus hand who is in love with the call of the fairgrounds as he travels through many different towns and states. As with Bob Dylan's Dream, we are invited to believe that the song is communicating the real-life experiences of the singer. This was a charade he would not be able to keep up for very long once he became truly famous and reporters began digging into his real background. But throughout his career he would continue to present his songs from behind a series of such masks. The angry politico, the philosophical lover, the surrealist, the symbolist poet, the family man, the tortured lover, the born-again prophet, the burned-out rock star and the travelling minstrel. As he demonstrates most effectively in this concert, the entire Bob Dylan identity is a kind of dramatic construct. In the New York Town Hall show, Dylan demonstrates his ability to assume a range of different personas. Later in the set, he will perform 2 more songs from his debut album. The traditional ballad Pretty Peggy O, another vehicle for his virtuoso harmonica playing, and a highly impassioned take of Curtis Jones' Highway 51 Blues, which is far more powerful than the studio recording, with Dylan bending and extending his vocal lines like a true bluesman and punctuating them with authentic Sonny Terry style blues harmonica. He shows that his repertoire includes both the whoops and hollers of mountain music and the growling tones of the blues, just as if he has really learned these songs from the mountain men of the Appalachians or the grizzled veterans of the Mississippi Delta. Dylan adopts a different persona, that of the reticent lover, when he presents us with debut performances of two of his greatest and most straightforward love songs, Boots of Spanish Leather and Tomorrow Is a Long Time. Before Boots, he adopts a shy, humble tone as he tells the audience, I used to be quite romantic. There is no doubt that he is still highly romantic as he delivers a pitch-perfect version of this evocative song of desperate yearning. Tomorrow is delivered in a similarly reverential tone. For some unknown reason, this staggeringly beautiful lament never made it onto a Dylan album. The Town Hall version was later included on the More Greatest Hits compilation in 1971. Before he sings the far more equivocal Don't Think Twice It's Alright, he sounds even shyer and more reticent, declaring that you're going to be pretty good to sing this song. I don't know if I can sing it really. I wrote it, so this is of course a rhetorical trick. He delivers an impassioned version of his great country ballad, Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. At other times, Dylan assumes a comic or satirical narrative approach. In the crudely confessional and highly suggestive ode to the pointlessness of empty intellectual philosophizing, if I could do it all over again, I'd do it all over you, and the lament of a sexually exhausted poor boy in Bob Dylan's New Orleans Rag, he adopts the voice of a lascivious drunkard, a trick he would later pull off on several songs from the Basement tapes. The audience responds enthusiastically to these lighter moments. He also applies his comic gifts to John Birch Society Blues, a rather heavy-handed but sharply funny satire on anti-communist paranoia, and Hero Blues, which he describes as being for all the boys that know girls that want them to go out and get themselves killed. The way Dylan delivers the payoff line from this song, you need a different kind of man, babe, one that can hold your heart. You need a different kind of man, babe, you need Napoleon Bonaparte, demonstrates his exquisite comic timing. Although Dylan projects himself as beatnik, hobo, lover and jester, the heart of the performance lies in the more serious songs in which he confronts contemporary social and political ills with such eloquence. Several of these songs are purely fictional. John Brown is another song that looks at how women can encourage men to go to war. Dylan adopts a third-person narrative to deliver the coup de grace of this stark narrative. When the maimed soldier returns from the conflict to meet his horrified mother, he merely drops his medals down into her hand. Dylan's performance is a dramatic tour de force of compelling storytelling. The bleak Ballad of Hollis Brown, in which a desperate farmer kills himself and his entire family, is delivered in a deathly deadpan. In Seven Curses, he relates a historic tale of how a young girl agrees to sleep with a hanging judge on the premise that this will save her father, who has been condemned for stealing a horse. The father is hanged anyway, and in the final verse, Dylan castigates the judge in no uncertain terms. In all of these songs, the narratives are constructed in order to rouse an audience into anger at injustice. In his didactic expose of the dangers of boxing, Who Killed Davy Moore, Dylan sings about the recent death of a real person, boxer Davy Moore, who died after receiving head injuries in the ring. The story is delivered here with heavily ironic emphasis, with Dylan virtually speaking the words. The song, which is based on the nursery rhyme Who Killed Cock Robin, has a very minimal tune. The boxer's opponent, his manager, the sports reporter and the crowd all deny responsibility for Moore's death. Before the rendition, Dylan's mumbled comments appear to support what he calls the abolishment of boxing. Ironically, in later life he would become a boxing aficionado, associating with leading boxers, doing sparring practice to keep himself fit, and even buying his own gym, not to mention eulogising wrongly imprisoned boxer Hurricane Carter. Davy Moore is the kind of song which works extremely well in this kind of context, with an attentive audience following the story carefully. They are never given a definitive answer to the question that the song asks, but we cannot fail to infer that all the respondents were responsible. Dylan also performs several protest songs which have yet to appear on his albums. Despite this, when he begins playing A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, there's a cheer of recognition from the crowd, who have presumably heard the song performed in folk clubs by Dylan or possibly by other artists. More recently composed Blowing in the Wind and With God on Our Side do not elicit a similar response. Before Masters of War, the final song prior to the encore, Dylan delivers an ambiguous, quasi-religious introduction, which is perhaps suitable for a song in which he castigates war profiteers, not only by wishing that they will die, but also by apparently condemning their souls. I believe in the 10 Commandments. The first one is, I am the Lord thy God. It's a great commandment if it's not said by the wrong people, says to the audience. He also gives a one-off rendition of You've Been Hiding Too Long, a very angry attack on white racists, rather lacking in his usual poetic subtlety, including in the very unambiguous You've been hiding too long behind the American flag. For his encore, Dylan carried out the audacious and unique act of reading his poem Last Thoughts on Woody Guthrie. This epic effort, arguably Dylan's most successful attempt at an extended poem, will be covered in a future blog in more detail. In it, he eulogises his great mentor and hero, identifying him with all that is real and authentic in American culture. Dylan had been visiting Guthrie, now debilitated by the genetic wasting disease Huntington's chorea, in hospital since his arrival in New York. The poem comes to a glorious climax with Dylan rhetorically asking the audience where they may find hope for the future, and then he concludes, you can either go to the church of your choice or you can go to Brooklyn State Hospital. Find God in the church of your choice, you'll find Woody Guthrie in Brooklyn State Hospital. And though it's only my opinion, I may be right or wrong, you'll find them both in the Grand Canyon at sundown. Dylan will never perform this remarkable work again. Although he appears to begin and end the show by embracing his Guthrie persona, he already seems to sense that it is time for him to move on. Many of the songs he has now composed are influenced by Guthrie's sensibilities. They attack hypocrisy, exploitation and miscarriages of justice, and point a finger accusingly at warmongers and racists in a way that would make Guthrie proud. But Dylan appears to sense that he has already superseded his role model, and now he presents what are truly his last thoughts on the great man with tremendous passion and intensity. In the 6 months between Dylan's appearance at the Town Hall and his concert at the larger and more prestigious Carnegie Hall, Dylan's public profile, like that of the early American astronauts who were making so many headlines at the time, ascends into the stratosphere. There's no doubt that he had the right stuff. In early May, he made headlines by refusing to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, American TV's biggest variety outlet, and he was refused permission to sing Talking John Birch Society Blues. Such a move might have killed other artists' careers, but his stance only increased his public profile as an anti-establishment rebel, at a time when few performers felt capable of challenging such bastions of mass entertainment. Later that month, the Freewheeling album was released. He formed a professional and personal relationship with Joan Baez, duetting with her on With God on Our Side at the Monterey Folk Festival and appearing regularly as a guest at her concerts. He also showed his willingness to contribute to the civil rights struggle by appearing at a voter registration rally in the heart of the redneck Deep South in Greenwood, Mississippi. In July, his appearance at the Newport Folk Festival, again including duets with Baez, culminates in a mass sing-along rendition of Blowing in the Wind, which now had become a worldwide hit for Peter, Paul and Mary. He made several TV and radio appearances, as well as recording the songs for his third album, Times They Are A-Changin'. At the end of August, He sang Only a Pawn in Their Game and When the Ship Comes In at the Washington Civil Rights March in front of some 250,000 people. Peter, Paul and Mary performed Blowing in the Wind, now adopted as the movement's anthem. Soon after this, as Martin Luther King delivered his epical I Have a Dream speech, a mesmerised Dylan stood just a few feet away. Already, he is part of American history. October the 26th, when he appears at Carnegie Hall, Dylan's public profile had made him, along with Baez, the most well-known face in American folk music. Already he was a pop star who had begun to attract hordes of screaming teenage girls. After the show, his friends had carefully engineered his escape from the venue. A few days before the show, a rather sensational Newsweek article had been published, exposing Dylan's stories about his supposedly rambling youth. This has no effect on Dylan's performance, which is a triumphant vindication of his new status. The Guthrie persona is now firmly in the past. He already looks more mature and is even more smartly dressed. Every selection is delivered with precision and great clarity and is greeted by the exultant responses from the crowd, despite the fact that many of the songs were being played live to an audience that had never heard them before. Only 7 of the 19 songs had featured in the Town Hall show. 8 were from the yet unreleased third album, along with 3 songs that were written for that album but never made the cut. The Carnegie Hall is a highly prestigious venue, chiefly dedicated to classical music, holding over 3,000 seats. But Dylan is not fazed. He begins with an exultant Times They Are A-Changin', the signature song which he would open his shows with until mid-1965. The performance of Who Killed Davy Moore is executed with far greater confidence than at the earlier show, with Dylan thoroughly inhabiting the voices of the song's characters. During Boots of Spanish Leather, one can hear the proverbial pin drop as he pours his emotions into the song. Before John Birch, he declares, "There ain't nothing wrong with this song." This draws a huge cheer from the crowd, who were clearly familiar with the story of the Sullivan controversy. Perhaps his biggest surprise of the evening, however, is Lay Down Your Weary Tune, a beautiful ode to the natural world and a precursor to visionary songs like Mr. Tambourine Man and Chimes of Freedom. Although the political songs are still being given pride of place, Dylan is already evolving at great speed. And here we get a glimpse of what he will go on to achieve in his next phase. It says much for the torrent of songs that Dylan was delivering in this period, that this wonderfully poetic creation, like many of the other songs performed at these 2 shows, never actually made it onto a Dylan album. Before Dylan sings his now famous Blowing in the Wind, he entertains the crowd with some dry humour, telling them a story about an English professor who, having misheard the words, claimed not to understand the song. The performance itself is stately and triumphant, in great contrast to the more tentative reading on Freewheeling. "How many times must a man look up," Dylan cries, "before he can really see the sky?" This is followed by a succession of protest songs, beginning with an extended 8-minute version of the unreleased Percy's song, in which Dylan relates a tale of a man imprisoned for 99 years for driving a car which was involved in a tragic accident. This is followed by 7 Curses and the Walls of Red Wing, a song attacking the brutality of a reform school which had been recorded for, but not included on, Freewheeling. In the next song, the starkly dramatic expose of ruthless capitalism, North Country Blues, Dylan delves into his real rather than his invented background, relating a riveting tale of the decline of a mining town on the Iron Range near Hibbing, Minnesota, where he had grown up. This is followed by a riveting Hard Rain, the last song before the intermission. The second half of the show begins with a lively Talking World War III blues, Dylan's most effective use of the talking blues format. Already he adapts the words from the recorded version. The singer he hears in the song is no longer the fictional Rockaday Johnny, but the contemporary pop star Fabian, who sings, "You love me and I love you, our loves are gonna grow, shooby-doo, shooby-doo." Such improvised lyrical variations were to become an important element in Dylan's future live performances, sealing the special bond between performer and audience. A rendition of Don't Think Twice, which follows, is more bluesy and nuanced than the Town Hall performance. Dylan alternates between loudly proclaimed and modestly understated lines, giving the song a considerable dramatic tension. For the next 6 minutes, Dylan turns raconteur, relating a long story to the audience about going to see a movie, the recently released Hootenanny Hoot, a blatant attempt by Hollywood to cash in on the folk boom. It demolishes the movie in a number of comic asides. "I'd like to tell you about it," he says. "I don't want any of you to go and see it." He then delivers a quick resume of the movie's ludicrous plot, explaining how a big Hollywood producer insists to his backers that making a TV show of a hootenanny he discovers by accident in the Midwest will sell soap. He also mocks the fact that the female singers performing in swimming suits to the accompaniment of drums that come out of nowhere. But then he insists that he and like-minded performers are decidedly not selling soap. He refers to the real Hootenanny TV show, which showcased commercialised folk music and which had just begun its run on the mainstream ABC TV channel, but which refused to feature Pete Seeger due to its anti-communist blacklist. Dylan, Baez, Tom Paxton and many other folk singers refused to appear on the show in protest. Here, Dylan expounds on the subject of such entertainment blacklists, employing the rhetorical trick of being supposedly puzzled by why such blacklists could come into place in the first place. He says that blacklisting is a bad thing. I don't know why it's a bad thing, but it's just bad all around. These pronouncements produce a hearty response from the audience. Having generated great political solidarity from the audience, Dylan completes the show by delivering inspired versions of 5 protest songs: With God on Our Side, Only a Pawn in Their Game, Masters of War, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, and When the Ship Comes In. His spoken introductions, often delivered in a faux naive tone, provide the audience with considerable food for thought. Before Masters, as he strums the ominous opening chords, he answers his critics by stating, "Some people say this song is very naive," putting in considerable ironic emphasis on the last word. What follows is quite extraordinarily unequivocal. "Well, I've got to stand here and really not care because I do actually hope that the Masters of War die tomorrow. Hattie Carroll is a true story. I wrote it from the newspaper." Before the rousing encore, he declares that, "I want to sing one song here recognising that there are Goliaths nowadays, and people don't realise just who the Goliaths are. But in the older days, Goliath was slayed, and everybody looks back nowadays and sees how cruel Goliath was. Nowadays there are crueler Goliaths who do crueler things, but one day they're going to be slain too. And people 2,000 years from now can look back and say, remember when Goliath II was slain." When the Ship Comes In, performed so recently in front of the huge Washington March audience, could be said to be Dylan's alternate version of Dr. King's legendary speech. Dylan has a dream too, in which the forces of freedom and justice will rise up and defeat the evil Goliaths of the day. Like King, Dylan employs quasi-biblical rhetoric to get his triumphant point over. The Carnegie Hall concert can be said to represent the high point of Dylan's status as a political spokesman. He delivers this astonishing crop of new songs to an audience who are hearing them with fresh ears and who respond with unrestrained enthusiasm. Yet, within a very short time, rapid change was in the air. Just a few weeks later, the Murder Most Foul of John F. Kennedy was about to occur. Soon, the Beatles would be arriving to hold the hands of a shocked and grieving nation. The political battleground of the 60s was about to unfold as Lyndon B. Johnson expanded the US's involvement in Vietnam. Dylan, having advanced himself to a position as the spokesman, the anger of his generation was to react to all this with a rapid volte-face. By the time of the Carnegie Hall show, he had already written all of his protest songs. Now his songs became more introspective, visionary and surreal, reflecting the fact that radical anti-establishment culture in the USA was soon about to take a very different turn. In this show, for a couple of intense and riveting hours, the 22-year-old Dylan encapsulates and defines the folk protest movement of the early 60s, producing definitive performances of the songs that made him famous. These 2 hours can be said to define a particular moment in American history in which youthful, radical opinion was united in a series of common causes. Here, Dylan truly embodies the role of the bard, the public poet, in a fully committed way, perhaps the last time in his career. He is the boy David, the boy who will be king, who aims to destroy the behemoth of the military-industrial complex and the racist American establishment, aimed only with his puny catapults. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. Do subscribe to my channel, have a look at my website and all that kind of stuff. If you really like the podcast, you might like to buy me a coffee, which basically means you go to a website and took me a couple of quid or something, however much a coffee costs these days. So if I've kept you amused for a little while, then you might want to do that. So if you want to do that, you'll have to go to buymeacoffee.com/Chris Gregoff, Gregof. Not quite sure why it says that, but that's me apparently. See you next time.
Is it rolling, Bob? Is it rolling, Bob? Is it rolling, Bob? Is it rolling, Bob? Is it rolling, Bob?